To understand the situation better, we're joined from Moscow by the narrative strategist Tatiana Kukhareva. Thank you so much for joining us today. Russia says the Ukrainian drone attacks have killed 6 civilians in Russian-controlled Crimea. How is this likely to affect the course of the conflict?
Well, unfortunately, because this conflict has been going on for so long, and casualties, sadly, are expected throughout this. Ukraine has been intensifying strikes on Russian territory, and Crimea is a strategic part of, the territories that have joined since 2014. So again, I don't believe that the response will be immediate. Usually any sort of intensification does get a response, but it's measured and also kind of strategically timed. But it does feel like the autumn is going to be quite intense. So, with everything that's going on. Yeah.
Of course, and Moscow does say that shipping in the Black Sea basin remains under threat. How significant is this for regional trade, global supply chains, and for maritime security?
Well, not just regional trade, but the global trade of wheat, for instance, and fertilizers, that's actually quite significant. Not to mention that, if we're talking about transportation of chemicals, and should the ship, in theory, be sunk by a drone attack, then we're looking at an potential ecological catastrophe, aren't we? So, that both Russia and Ukraine account for quite a large part of global supply of wheat. Russia also has extensive contracts in terms of fertilizer trade. So, if the attacks intensify even further, obviously there's going to be, I believe the leadership has already been looking into kind of diversifying routes in terms of wheat supply, but surely any further disruption would, the global wheat market would feel that significantly.
And Tatiana, could the growing use of drones and attacks on strategic infrastructure make it even more difficult for both sides to return to the negotiating table?
Well, in this respect, Tom, we have to understand that this conflict has been unique in a way, because there hasn't ever been there's not been a conflict where the use of drones has been that extensive. I would say that it's not so much about the use of drones, but yes, of course, the attacks on infrastructure do make it more difficult in the sense where, the mood within the population of the country changes significantly with any such attacks, should they be successful, especially inside Russia. However, again, if we're talking about any sort of real negotiations, then I would have to reiterate that at this point, and Vladimir Putin has said it repeatedly, that at this point, any direct negotiation between Moscow and Kiev, it doesn't look like they would produce anything, because this conflict is only going on because of the extensive support of the Western backers to Kiev, and from that perspective, any sort of negotiation will have to continue and that would be the negotiation between Moscow and the Western parties that are bankrolling this conflict.
Both sides continuing to target areas far from the front lines. Is there a growing risk that the conflict could spill over into a wider regional security crisis?
That's $1 million question, isn't it? Well, technically, if we think back to 2022, and even earlier than that, the whole reasoning behind this extensive lethal aid that's what we used to call it, before 2022, lethal aid to Ukraine, was that it was set to kind of counter the threat of a regional security predicament, so to speak. And seeing just how deeply the European states have been involved with this conflict, listening to statements coming out of the recent NATO summit saying that, that NATO states have to stay strong because, and I'm paraphrasing here, but basically they cannot let Russia win this. It doesn't paint a picture in which those states are not already involved, and it is already not a much larger crisis. Because, if we listen to the statements coming from the heads of NATO states, then it is literally the admission of NATO being very well involved in this conflict, and that by default means that this conflict is not just Russia against Ukraine. It is very much Russia against NATO. It's just that it's not yet official.
Tatiana, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.